I never thought I'd be afraid of a Christmas tree. Growing up, it was always the centerpiece of our holiday celebrations, glowing warmly in the corner of the living room, surrounded by gifts and laughter. This year was different, though. This year, the tree wasn't just an ornament. It was alive, and it was watching me. It all started the night after we brought the tree home. My mom and I had picked out the tallest, fullest pine we could find at the lot. It smelled fresh, and its branches were perfect for holding ornaments. We decorated it with shiny baubles, sparkling tinsel, and colorful lights. Mom even placed a glittery star on top, just like we did every year. But as I stood back to admire our work, something felt wrong. The tree looked perfect, but there was a heaviness in the air. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it felt as though the room had grown colder. The lights on the tree flickered slightly, but I brushed it off as a wiring issue. By the time we finished, it was late, and I was ready for bed. That night, I woke up suddenly, my room eerily silent. Normally, I could hear the faint hum of the furnace or the creaks of the house settling. But now, there was nothing, just silence. I turned over, trying to get comfortable again, but then I noticed something. The faint glow of the Christmas tree lights was visible under my door. That wasn't right. Mom always turned them off before bed. I tried to ignore it, telling myself she must have forgotten. But then, I heard it. A faint rustling sound like someone running their fingers through the tree's branches. My breath caught in my throat. I told myself it was just the wind outside, but my windows were shut tight. The sound grew louder, closer. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and stared at my door. I don't know why, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. Instead, I slid out of bed and crept toward the door, pressing my ear against it. For a moment, there was silence again. I almost laughed at myself, thinking I was just imagining things. But then something tapped against the door. Soft, deliberate, and rhythmic. My knees buckled and I stumbled back, clamping a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. I stayed there, frozen, until the tapping stopped. I don't remember falling asleep, but the next thing I knew, it was morning. Sunlight streamed through my window, and the faint smell of pine filled the air. I almost convinced myself it was a bad dream. Almost. When I went downstairs, the tree looked normal, beautiful even. But as I got closer, I noticed something odd. One of the ornaments, a shiny red bauble, had a crack running through it. I didn't remember that being there before. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it had fallen and I hadn't noticed. But then I saw another, and another. Almost all of the ornaments had tiny hairline cracks in them, as if they'd been squeezed too tightly. That night, I couldn't sleep. I left my door cracked open, just enough to see the glow of the tree in the hallway. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but deep down I knew something was wrong. The rustling started again, faint at first, then louder. I clutched my blanket, trembling. Then I heard it. A soft, whispery voice, like the wind through dead leaves. It was coming from the tree. I couldn't make out the words at first, but as I strained to listen, I realized it wasn't speaking. It was humming, a slow, haunting tune that sounded like a twisted version of a Christmas carol. My stomach churned, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it to stop, but the humming grew louder, filling my ears, my head. I don't know what possessed me, but I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. I crept down the hallway, my heart thundering in my chest. The tree loomed in the darkness, its branches unnaturally still. The lights on it flickered erratically, casting strange shadows on the walls. As I got closer, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The ornaments weren't just cracked, they were shattered, jagged pieces hanging by thin threads. The tinsel looked like it had been torn apart, and the glittery star on top was bent, as if crushed by an unseen hand. But the worst part was the eyes. Deep within the branches, two faintly glowing orbs stared back at me. They weren't ornaments. They blinked. My knees gave out and I dropped the phone. The flashlight beam swung wildly, landing on the base of the tree. That's when I saw them. Roots, black and gnarled, stretching across the floor like veins. They pulsed, as if alive. I scrambled back, choking on a scream, but the roots shot out toward me, curling around my ankles. The tree's branches shook violently, and the humming turned into a guttural growl. I clawed at the floor, trying to break free, but the roots tightened, pulling me closer. The last thing I saw before the world went dark was the tree's glowing eyes, unblinking and filled with malice. When I woke up, it was morning. The tree was gone. The living room was empty, as if it had never been there. My mom acted like nothing was wrong, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching me, waiting for the right moment to return. It started a few nights before Christmas. I had just moved into a small, quiet house at the edge of town, hoping for a peaceful holiday. The nights were silent except for the occasional howl of wind brushing against the windows. I spent my evenings alone, sipping hot cocoa, watching Christmas movies, and decorating the little tree I had picked out. It was supposed to be a calm, uneventful December. On the night it all began, I heard a knock at the door. It was strange because no one ever visited me, especially not at that hour. I hesitated for a moment before opening the door. Outside there was no one, just the biting cold and swirling snowflakes. But there it was, a small, neatly wrapped package lying on my doorstep. Its crimson paper was tied with a black ribbon that looked oddly out of place for Christmas. There was no note, no address, no sign of who might have left it. Curiosity got the better of me, and I brought it inside. The package felt unnaturally heavy for its size. I debated whether to open it, but something about it gnawed at my mind. It wasn't excitement or anticipation. It was dread. When I finally untied the ribbon and peeled back the paper, I found a small wooden box, beautifully carved but old. The wood was rough, and it had a faint smell of damp earth. As I opened the box, I found a single item inside, a porcelain doll. Its face was pale and cracked, and its black eyes seemed to follow me wherever I moved. There was something unsettling about it, but I couldn't put my finger on why. I placed the doll on the table and tried to shake off the eerie feeling, convincing myself it was just someone's idea of a joke. But that night, the house felt different, colder, darker. As I lay in bed, I thought I heard faint whispers, too soft to make out, but enough to make my skin crawl. I told myself it was the wind. The next morning, the doll wasn't on the table where I'd left it. It was sitting on the couch, its lifeless eyes fixed on the TV. I was sure I hadn't moved it. My heart raced as I stared at it, but I told myself I must have forgotten. I picked it up and shoved it into a cupboard, slamming the door shut. That evening, as I cooked dinner, I heard a loud thud coming from the living room. My stomach dropped. Slowly, I walked over to the cupboard, every step feeling heavier than the last. The door was wide open, and the doll was back on the table. Its head was tilted slightly to the side, as if it was mocking me. My hands trembled as I grabbed the doll and threw it outside into the snow. I locked the door and tried to convince myself it was over. But it wasn't. That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. They were soft and deliberate, like someone walking barefoot. I froze in bed, too scared to move. The sound stopped outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, praying it was my imagination. Then came the faintest knock. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The door creaked open even though I knew I had locked it. There was no one there, just the darkness of the hallway. But at the foot of my bed sat the doll. Its head was tilted back, its mouth slightly open now, revealing tiny, sharp teeth I hadn't noticed before. A faint giggle echoed through the room. I couldn't stay in that house another second. I grabbed my coat and bolted out the door, not caring about the snow or the cold. As I ran down the empty streets, I felt like something was chasing me. The sound of tiny footsteps followed, but every time I looked back, there was nothing there. I checked into a motel that night, desperate to feel safe. But as I sat on the bed, trying to calm my racing heart, I noticed something on the nightstand. It was the wooden box. The black ribbon was neatly tied around it again. My hands shook as I reached for it. When I opened it, the doll was there, smiling at me with those cracked porcelain lips. I don't know how I'm writing this now. The doll is sitting in the corner watching me. I can't escape it. Wherever I go, it follows. I've thought about destroying it, but I'm too scared of what might happen if I try. If you ever find a strange package on your doorstep, please, for the love of everything good, don't open it. It all started with an innocent tradition. Every Christmas Eve, my family and I would leave cookies and milk on the table for Santa. It was a harmless gesture, a nod to the magic of childhood. But this year, something changed. Something darker arrived with the snow and holiday cheer. I was the last one awake, as always. My parents had long since gone to bed, and my younger brother Timmy was snoring in his room, dreaming of presents under the tree. The living room was quiet, except for the crackling of the fire and the soft hum of the Christmas lights. The air felt heavy, though, as if something unseen was lingering in the shadows. I placed the plate of cookies on the table and set the glass of milk beside it. As I turned to leave, I noticed a folded piece of paper that hadn't been there before. It was old, yellowed, and looked like it had been burnt around the edges. Curious, I opened it. The words inside were written in dark red ink, or maybe something worse. "To Santa's list keeper," it began. "Do you know what happens to the naughty children?" A chill ran down my spine. I wasn't sure if it was a prank or my imagination, but the room suddenly felt colder. I turned to the fireplace, but the flames had dwindled to embers, barely giving off any heat. That's when I heard it. A faint scratching noise, like nails dragging against wood. It came from the chimney. I stared, frozen as ash began to fall, scattering across the hearth. A deep, guttural breathing followed, echoing up the dark shaft. The kind of sound that doesn't belong to anything human. Before I could scream, something tumbled out of the chimney. At first I thought it was Santa. His red suit was unmistakable. But as the figure rose to its full height, I realized it wasn't the jolly old man from the stories. His suit was torn, smeared with soot, and something wet and dark. His face wasn't cheerful. It was sunken, pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. In his hands, he held a massive scroll, tied with a ribbon. It unrolled as he approached me, and I could see that it wasn't paper at all. It looked like skin, stitched together in a grotesque patchwork. The names on it shimmered faintly, written in that same dark red ink. "Good children get presents," he said, his voice a harsh rasp. "But the naughty, they get their souls collected." I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there, but my legs refused to move. He raised a bony hand and pointed at me. "You've been good," he whispered, his cracked lips curling into something that was almost a smile but not quite. "But your brother, Timmy, oh, he's been very naughty." "No!" I shouted, finding my voice at last. "He's just a kid. He hasn't done anything wrong." The figure tilted his head as if considering my words. "Every child leaves traces," he said. "Little lies, little sins. They add up." I felt a tear slip down my cheek. "Please," I begged. "Take me instead." He laughed then, a hollow, echoing sound that made the Christmas lights flicker. "It doesn't work that way. His name is already on the list." I turned and ran to Timmy's room. He was asleep, sprawled across his bed with a stuffed reindeer clutched to his chest. I shook him awake, whispering his name, begging him to stay quiet. "Timmy, we have to go," I said. "What's wrong?" he asked, rubbing his eyes. Before I could answer, the bedroom door creaked open. The figure stepped inside, dragging the scroll behind him. "It's too late," he rasped. I grabbed Timmy's hand and bolted out of the room. We ran downstairs, but the front door wouldn't budge. The windows were frosted over, the ice so thick it looked like it had been growing for years. "Where do you think you can hide?" the figure called, his voice echoing through the house. I pulled Timmy into the kitchen and grabbed the biggest knife I could find. My hands were trembling, but I held it in front of me as the figure appeared in the doorway. "You can't fight me," he said, his hollow eyes fixed on mine. "I've been collecting for centuries." Desperation surged through me. "Why?" I demanded. "Why do this?" He smiled again, that twisted, hollow grin. "The naughty fuel the magic of Christmas. Without their souls, there would be no gifts, no cheer, no holiday spirit. Someone must pay." Timmy clung to me, tears streaming down his face. I didn't know what to do. The figure moved closer, his bony hand reaching for my brother. In that moment, I did the only thing I could think of. I lunged forward with the knife. It sank into his chest with a sickening crunch, but instead of blood, black smoke poured out. He staggered back, his hollow eyes blazing with something between rage and amusement. "This isn't over," he hissed, his voice fading as the smoke consumed him. "The list never ends." And just like that, he was gone. The house was silent again, but the air still felt heavy. I looked at the spot where the figure had stood, and there, on the floor, was the scroll. Timmy's name had vanished, but mine was now at the very top. The next Christmas Eve, I'll be waiting. The bells rang again last night, always at midnight, always when the world feels still and the air hangs heavy, like something unseen is watching. I didn't think much of it the first time it happened. It was late December, and I figured it was just the old church down the street. Bells ring during the holidays, right? That's normal. But these weren't normal. They sounded wrong. The first time, I was lying in bed, half asleep, when the deep, hollow chimes broke through the silence. It wasn't just the sound that got to me. It was the way it seemed to echo inside my chest, rattling like a warning. I sat up listening, heart pounding for no reason I could explain. I told myself it was nothing. Bells couldn't hurt you. I pulled the blankets up and eventually fell asleep. The next night, it happened again. Midnight. Clear and deliberate. But this time, the sound felt closer, as if the bells weren't coming from the church, but somewhere nearer, just outside maybe. I pressed my face against the icy window, staring into the darkness, but saw nothing unusual. The street was empty, blanketed in fresh snow. Only the faint glow of a street lamp pierced the shadows. I shook my head, muttering to myself, "You're being ridiculous," and crawled back into bed. On the third night, the bells were louder. They weren't just ringing, they were calling. This time, I couldn't ignore them. I grabbed my coat and flashlight, pulled on my boots, and stepped into the freezing night air. The snow crunched beneath my feet as I followed the sound. The air smelled sharp and metallic, like something rotting beneath the frost. The ringing guided me down the street, past the old church, and into the woods. My flashlight flickered. Cheap batteries, I thought, but it stayed on just long enough for me to see the first set of footprints in the snow. They weren't mine. The prints were long and narrow, too deep for a person but too small for an animal. They didn't sink like something solid had made them, but they twisted unnaturally, as if something had crawled instead of walked. I felt my stomach tighten, but I kept going. I don't know why. I couldn't stop myself. The bells were pulling me. The forest was silent, unnaturally so. No wind, no animals, just the relentless tolling of those horrible bells, growing louder with every step. And then I saw it. A small, ruined chapel hidden deep in the woods, its windows shattered, its doors hanging crooked on their hinges. The bells were coming from inside. I hesitated at the threshold. My breath came in quick bursts, visible in the icy air. Something inside me screamed to turn back, but my legs wouldn't listen. The bells rang again, and I pushed the door open. It groaned like a wounded animal. Inside, the air was colder than it was outside. My flashlight flickered again, and this time, it died completely. I stood there in the dark, shivering, as the bells stopped. The silence was worse than the sound. I strained to hear something, anything, but there was only my own heartbeat, loud and frantic in my ears. And then I saw them. Pale shapes, barely visible in the shadows, shifting and swaying. They were tall, too tall, with elongated arms that reached almost to the floor. Their faces, if you could call them faces, were blank, smooth, featureless, but I could feel them staring. I stumbled back, bumping into the pews, and their heads snapped toward me in unison. The sound of their movements was wet, like something dragging itself through mud. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut, trapping me inside. The bells rang again, louder than ever, almost deafening. The figures moved closer, their limbs bending at unnatural angles. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the relentless tolling. One of them reached for me, its fingers impossibly long, curling like smoke. I felt a sharp, cold pain in my chest, like ice spreading through my veins. My vision blurred and the world tilted sideways. When I woke up, I was lying in the snow outside the chapel. My flashlight was shattered beside me. The chapel itself was gone, as if it had never been there. Only the footprints remained, leading back into the darkness. I don't know how I got home that night. My memory is a blur, and my body aches in places I can't explain. But the worst part is, the bells haven't stopped. Midnight, every night they ring louder and closer than before. And now, when I look out my window, I swear I see those figures standing just beyond the street lamp, watching, waiting. The bells are calling me again tonight. It started with a single package on our doorstep, small and wrapped in shiny green paper with a red bow. There was no tag, no note, just the faint smell of pine. My first thought was that it was an early Christmas gift from a neighbor, but something about it felt wrong. The air around it seemed colder than the rest of the house, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I picked it up. Inside was a small elf doll, no bigger than my hand. Its face was painted with an unnerving smile, its glassy eyes wide and staring, as if it had caught me doing something I shouldn't have. I don't know why, but I hated it instantly. Still, I placed it on the mantel above the fireplace, thinking it was just another harmless holiday decoration. That night I was woken up by a faint tapping noise. It was rhythmic and sharp, like tiny nails scratching against wood. I thought it was just a branch against the window, but when I got up to check, the tapping stopped. The window was clear, the night calm. As I turned to go back to bed, I swore I heard a faint giggle, high-pitched and fleeting, like a child trying to stifle laughter. The next morning, the elf was no longer on the mantel. I found it sitting at the kitchen table, its tiny arms propped up like it had been waiting for breakfast. My stomach churned. No one else in the house would have moved it, and even if they had, why leave it like that? I tried to laugh it off, convincing myself I must have done it absent-mindedly, though deep down, I didn't believe it. The day passed uneventfully, but by evening, the air in the house felt heavier, almost suffocating. I avoided looking at the elf, but its presence felt impossible to ignore. It was as if it was watching me, waiting for something. I decided to throw it out. Grabbing it by its stiff little body, it started with the first snowfall of December. Our small town transformed into a picturesque winter wonderland, with snow-covered rooftops, twinkling lights, and carolers filling the streets with festive songs. I was back home for the holidays, staying at my parents' old house. Everything felt warm and familiar, except for one strange detail: the snowman in the front yard. I didn't remember building it. Neither did my parents. It stood tall, unnaturally perfect, with its round body stacked flawlessly. Its eyes were made of black stones that gleamed like polished onyx, and its grin, carved out of twigs, felt too wide, almost mocking. At first, I thought it was just some neighborhood kid's prank, a festive gesture, perhaps. But the unease settled in my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the snowman. Something about it felt alive. From my bedroom window, I could see it clearly, illuminated by the yellow glow of the street lamp. Its shadow stretched across the yard, longer than it should have been. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but when I blinked, I swore its grin had widened. The next morning, I told my parents about it. My mom laughed it off, calling me paranoid, and my dad shrugged, saying, "It's just a snowman, kiddo." But when I stepped outside to inspect it, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The stones that formed its eyes weren't smooth anymore. They were jagged, sharp. Worse, the snow around its base was tinged with red, as if someone had spilled paint or blood. I decided to knock it down. I grabbed a shovel and marched into the yard, determined to get rid of the thing. As I raised the shovel, I hesitated. The air around the snowman felt colder, biting, like a pocket of frozen death. My breath came out in shaky puffs, and I swore I heard a faint whisper, almost a hiss. My heart pounded, but I swung the shovel anyway. The blade struck the snowman's torso, and for a moment, I felt relief. But as the snow crumbled, something fell out. A doll. A porcelain doll, its face cracked and eyes missing. I stumbled back, dropping the shovel. The whisper grew louder, swirling around me like the wind. But there was no wind. Just an oppressive silence, broken by that sound. A low, guttural laugh coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. That night, I locked all the doors and closed every curtain. My parents were asleep, unaware of my growing panic. I sat in the living room, staring at the fireplace, trying to calm my racing mind. But then I heard it. A soft thud, then another. It was coming from outside. I peeked through the curtains, my hands trembling. The snowman was back. Its body was whole again, standing in the exact same spot. Only now it was closer to the house. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. Its grin stretched impossibly wide, and its eyes, those jagged stones, glowed faintly, like embers. It was staring at me. I backed away from the window, clutching the curtains tightly. My mind raced. Was I losing it? I grabbed my phone and called the police. When they arrived, the snowman was gone. The yard was empty, pristine, as if nothing had ever been there. The officers looked at me like I was crazy. One of them even joked, "Too much eggnog, huh?" That night, the whispers returned. They were inside the house now, seeping through the walls. I locked myself in my room, barricading the door with a chair. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as the temperature dropped. Frost formed on the windows and the whispers turned into voices, chanting in a language I couldn't understand. And then, I heard footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, crunching against the snow outside. They stopped right below my window. My heart felt like it was about to burst. Slowly, I forced myself to look. The snowman was there, staring up at me. Its head tilted slightly as if mocking my fear. This time it had arms, long, twisted branches that scratched at the glass. I didn't sleep that night. When morning came, the snowman was gone, but the dread lingered. My parents insisted I was imagining things, but I knew better. That thing wasn't just a snowman. It was something far older, far darker, hiding behind a mask of winter cheer. I left town the next day, unable to stay another night. But sometimes when the world grows quiet and the snow begins to fall, I hear the whispers again, and I know it's still out there, waiting. I still remember the day I found the letter. It was the 23rd of December, and the first snow had blanketed the small town I lived in. Our house, nestled at the edge of the woods, had always felt a bit too quiet during the holidays. My parents were away for the weekend, leaving me alone with the old traditions and flickering lights of our Christmas tree. The day had been uneventful until I checked the mailbox. Among the usual cards and bills, there was an envelope, old, yellowed, and sealed with a red wax stamp. There was no return address, just my name scrawled in jagged, uneven letters. It wasn't the neat handwriting of someone sending holiday cheer. It looked desperate. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I broke the seal and pulled out the letter. The paper was coarse, and the writing looked hurried, as if the sender had been in a rush, or afraid. The words were sharp, almost etched into the page. "To the naughty, you've gone unnoticed for too long. This year you are seen. He is coming." I laughed nervously, trying to dismiss it as a prank, but the words clung to me. He is coming. Who? And what did they mean by the naughty? My heart thumped harder as I reread the message. The evening felt heavier, like the snow outside was pressing against the house. That night, the house grew unnervingly silent. The wind outside howled, its fingers tapping against my window. I tried distracting myself with Christmas movies, but I couldn't shake the letter from my mind. I left it on the kitchen table, but its presence was like a shadow in the corner of my eye. At around midnight, the first strange sound came. It was faint, like sleigh bells, but slower and off-key. They jingled briefly, then stopped. I thought I was imagining it until I heard them again. Closer this time. My stomach twisted as I crept toward the window. I didn't see anyone, but the snow outside was unbroken. No tracks, no sign of movement. I locked the doors, convincing myself it was just the wind. But as I turned back toward the living room, the lights on the tree flickered, then died. The room plunged into darkness except for the soft glow of the fireplace. My breath caught as I felt a shift in the air, like I wasn't alone anymore. A scraping sound came from the chimney. It wasn't the faint noise of settling bricks. It was deliberate, like claws raking against the stone. The fire sputtered and went out, leaving nothing but a faint smell of burnt wood. My hands trembled as I grabbed my phone, but the screen wouldn't turn on. Dead, just like the lights. Then came the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, echoing from somewhere above me. The sound of something impossibly large moving through the house. My throat tightened as I realized it was heading toward the stairs. I scrambled back into the living room, pressing myself against the wall. The bells rang again, louder, accompanied by the crunch of boots on the wooden steps. My breathing grew shallow. I couldn't move. I couldn't even think. The letter flashed in my mind. He is coming. The figure that emerged from the shadows wasn't Santa. He was tall, impossibly tall, his head grazing the ceiling. His body was cloaked in tattered red robes that smelled of decay and ash. Long, curved horns jutted from his skull, framing a face that was both monstrous and cruelly human. His eyes burned like embers, and his mouth twisted into a grin that showed jagged yellow teeth. "Have you been good this year?" The voice was deep, guttural, and mocking. He didn't wait for an answer. He held up a sack, much like the one you'd imagine Santa carrying, but it writhed. It was filled with something alive. I could hear faint cries and muffled screams coming from inside. I couldn't breathe. My legs wouldn't move. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I was frozen. He reached into the sack and pulled out a long chain. At the end of it dangled rusted, bloodied hooks. The grin on his face grew wider, almost splitting his skin. "You've been forgotten for too long," he said, dragging the chain across the floor. Sparks flew as the hooks scraped the wood. "But I remember. I always remember." I screamed, finally breaking free of my paralysis, and bolted toward the front door. My hands fumbled with the lock, but I could hear him closing in. The bells grew deafening, and I felt the air around me grow colder, sharper. The door wouldn't budge. My vision blurred with tears as I turned to face him, but the room was empty. The silence was more terrifying than his presence. My chest heaved as I searched the shadows, waiting for him to strike. When the lights flickered back on, the house was exactly as it had been, except for the letter now lying at my feet. Another line had been added beneath the original message. "You escaped this time, not next year. I've never looked at Christmas the same way again." It was Christmas Eve, and the snow fell silently outside my grandmother's old, creaky house. The family had gathered in the living room, warming themselves by the fireplace, exchanging gifts, and laughing. I wasn't feeling festive, though. I'd always hated that house. Its long, dark hallways, the constant groaning of the wooden floors, and the strange way shadows danced on the walls, even when no one was moving. This year, Grandma had insisted I sleep in the guest room at the far end of the house, the one nobody liked. It was always cold, no matter how many blankets you piled on. I told myself it was just an old house, but as the night went on, I couldn't shake the uneasiness creeping up my spine. I climbed into bed around midnight, pulling the heavy quilt over me. The house had grown eerily quiet. Everyone else had gone to bed, and the only sound was the wind howling outside. I tried to sleep, but I kept hearing faint noises. A soft scraping sound like fingernails against wood. I told myself it was just a branch against the window. But then the noises moved. First to the left of the room near the wardrobe, then closer to the foot of my bed. I froze, holding my breath, ears straining. The sound wasn't random anymore. It was deliberate, rhythmic. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. I finally forced myself to sit up and look around. The dim glow from the hallway seeped through the cracked door, casting a sliver of light on the floor. Nothing moved. My heart pounded, but I told myself to stop being ridiculous. It was just my imagination, I thought. I lay back down and pulled the covers tighter around me. I closed my eyes, determined to fall asleep. That's when I heard it again. Closer this time. A soft, almost playful hum, like a child's voice singing a broken version of Silent Night. Silent night. Holy night. The melody was slow and off-key, the voice thin and raspy. It wasn't coming from the hallway. It was inside the room. My eyes flew open and I saw it. A figure standing in the corner near the wardrobe. It was small, like a child, but its face was all wrong. The eyes were hollow, dark pits, and its mouth was stretched into a crooked grin, too wide for its face. The skin was pale, almost translucent, like it didn't belong in this world. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The thing took a step closer, dragging something behind it. A sack. It looked heavy, and the contents shifted inside as it moved. I wanted to run, but my body was paralyzed with fear. Silent night. Holy night. It sang again, its head tilting unnaturally to the side. My breath came in shallow gasps as it shuffled closer. I finally managed to whisper, "What? What do you want?" It stopped, its grin growing wider. The thing dropped the sack and something rolled out of it. Something that made bile rise in my throat. It was a doll, but not just any doll. It was dressed in a little red coat with a white fur trim. Its face looked exactly like mine. I scrambled back, falling off the bed and onto the floor. My heart felt like it would burst out of my chest. The thing crouched down, its black pits for eyes staring into me as it pointed at the doll. "Join us," it hissed, the voice like dry leaves scraping against stone. I shook my head violently, tears streaming down my face. "No, stay away." It laughed, a hollow, echoing sound that made the walls tremble. The light from the hallway flickered, then went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. I crawled backward, desperate to get away until my back hit the wall. Then I felt it. Cold fingers brushed against my ankle. I kicked wildly, but there was nothing there. The thing's laughter filled the room, louder now, overlapping with the scraping sound that seemed to come from everywhere. I don't remember how I found the strength, but I jumped up and bolted out of the room, not daring to look back. The house seemed endless as I ran through the dark hallways, the shadows stretching and twisting around me. I swear I could still hear it humming that haunting tune. When I finally burst into the living room, the fire had gone out. My family was gone. The chairs were empty, their cushions ripped open, stuffing spilling onto the floor. The Christmas tree stood in the corner, but it was different now. The ornaments were shattered, and the lights flickered weakly. And at the top of the tree, instead of a star, sat the doll. My doll. It turned its head slowly to face me, that same twisted grin spreading across its tiny porcelain face. I screamed and ran out into the snow, not stopping until the house was far behind me. No one believed me when I told them what happened. Grandma just shook her head, saying I must have had a bad dream. But I know what I saw. And every year since, on Christmas Eve, I hear it again. Silent night. Holy night. The snow fell heavily that December night, blanketing the small town in silence. The streets were eerily empty, save for the soft glow of Christmas lights that flickered weakly in the cold. I had always loved the carolers who roamed the neighborhood every year, their songs filling the air with warmth. But this year was different. It started when I heard the faint melody outside my window, a soft, almost whispered version of Silent Night. I looked at the clock. It was 1:13 a.m. Odd. Carolers never came out this late. Curious, I pulled back the curtain, expecting to see a cheerful group bundled in scarves and hats. But the street was empty. The singing grew louder, the voices blending in a chilling harmony. It was hauntingly beautiful, but there was something off about it, something that made my stomach twist. I leaned closer to the window, straining to see anyone in the streetlight's dim glow. That's when I noticed movement at the far end of the road. Figures cloaked in black, slowly walking toward my house. I told myself it was just a group of late-night revelers, maybe some teenagers playing a prank. But the way they moved, their steps synchronized to the rhythm of the carol, sent shivers down my spine. The voices didn't match their pace. They were too smooth, too perfect, as if the sound came from somewhere else entirely. I stepped away from the window, my heart pounding. The singing didn't stop. It grew louder, closer. I thought of calling the police, but what would I say? A group of creepy carolers is outside my house. They'd think I was crazy. Then I heard the knock. 3 slow, deliberate taps on the door. I froze. My mind raced with excuses not to answer. But when the knock came again, louder this time, something compelled me to move. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something darker. I opened the door a crack. The figures stood on my porch, their faces hidden beneath hoods. They didn't look up. Instead, They raised their heads just enough for me to see their mouths, wide, unnatural grins that stretched too far across their pale faces. The singing stopped. "Will you sing with us?" one of them asked, their voice soft and hollow, like wind through a graveyard. My throat tightened. I wanted to slam the door to run, but I couldn't move. "You must join us," another said, its voice blending eerily with the first. They reached out with thin, bony hands, and I stumbled back, slamming the door shut. My heart pounded as I fumbled to lock it. But when I turned around, they were standing inside my living room. I gasped, stumbling back against the wall. Their grins widened as they began to sing again. This time, the melody was warped, dissonant, like nails scraping glass. The air grew colder, my breath visible in the dim light of the room. I covered my ears, but the song seeped into my head, filling my mind with unbearable images. Dark forests, shadowy figures, screams that echoed endlessly. I tried to speak, to beg them to stop, but no sound came out. My voice was gone. One of them stepped closer, their grin impossibly wide. "Once you hear our song," they whispered, "you can never forget it." I ran, bolting up the stairs to my bedroom. I slammed the door and locked it, shoving a dresser in front of it for good measure. But the singing didn't stop. It was inside me now, reverberating through my skull. I pressed my hands to my ears, tears streaming down my face. That's when I noticed the photo on my nightstand. It was a picture of my family from last Christmas, all of us smiling by the tree. But now, the faces were different. My parents and siblings all wore the same wide, unnatural grins as the figures downstairs. The door creaked behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. The air grew colder, and I felt a hand on my shoulder, icy and unyielding. "Sing with us," the voice whispered again, this time right next to my ear. I don't remember much after that. When I woke up, it was morning. The house was quiet, the air still. But the picture on my nightstand was different. It showed me standing with the carolers, my face twisted into the same horrific grin. I haven't left the house since. The singing hasn't stopped. It plays in my mind, a constant, haunting melody. And now, when I look out the window at night, I see others walking the streets. Neighbors, strangers, all with those same chilling smiles. They're looking for someone to join them. I try not to listen, but I know it's only a matter of time before their song takes me completely. It was Christmas Eve, and the house was quiet except for the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards. The soft glow of the tree lights flickered in the corner of the living room. Beneath it, a mountain of presents waited to be opened. One gift stood out, wrapped in crimson paper with a gold ribbon. It hadn't been there earlier. I was sure of it. The gift was small, about the size of a shoebox, and it had no tag. I asked my parents if they'd placed it there, but both of them shook their heads. "Maybe it's from Santa," my mom joked, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Something about that package felt wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep. My room felt colder than usual, and I could hear faint noises. A soft thud, a shuffle. I pulled the blanket tighter around me and tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just the house settling, or the wind outside. But then I heard it. The sound of something scraping against the floor. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The sound was coming from the living room. I wanted to call out for my parents, but my throat felt tight, like the words were stuck. Instead, I grabbed the small flashlight from my nightstand and crept out of my room. The hallway stretched ahead, the darkness swallowing everything except for the faint glow of the Christmas lights. As I approached the living room, the noises grew louder. It wasn't just scraping anymore. It sounded like whispering, high-pitched, almost like a child's voice, but too faint to understand. I stopped at the doorway, shining my flashlight into the room. The red-wrapped present was gone. The tree lights flickered again, casting strange shadows on the walls. That's when I saw it, a small figure standing by the couch. Its back was to me, and it was no taller than my knee. It wore a tattered red outfit, and a crooked grin stretched across its face. It was the toy from the mysterious package. Its head turned slowly, unnaturally, until it faced me. Its black, button-like eyes seemed to pierce right through me, and its grin widened, showing tiny, jagged teeth. I froze, unable to move or scream. It tilted its head and whispered something I couldn't make out. Then, it moved. The toy darted toward me on its tiny legs, faster than anything that size should be able to move. I stumbled backward, the flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. In the darkness, I could hear it scurrying, its footsteps unnervingly loud against the hardwood. I ran. I didn't think, I just ran. I burst into my parents' room, slamming the door behind me. "There's something in the house!" I shouted. But they didn't wake up. They were lying there, completely still. Too still. I shook my mom's shoulder, and her head lolled to the side. Her eyes were wide open, staring at nothing. A horrible scream built in my throat, but before it could escape, I heard the sound again. The toy's footsteps, right outside the door. The doorknob began to turn, slowly, deliberately. I grabbed a chair and wedged it under the handle, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold on. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a small, scratchy voice whispered through the crack under the door. "Let me in." I backed away, my chest heaving. The voice laughed, a high-pitched, chilling sound that echoed in the room. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging everything into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, but before I could find it, I felt something cold wrap around my ankle. I screamed and kicked, but the grip was strong, pulling me toward the door. The toy's laughter grew louder, echoing in my ears. Desperate, I grabbed the bedside lamp and swung it downward. The bulb shattered, and the grip on my ankle released. I scrambled to my feet, but when I looked back, the room was empty. The door was open, the hallway beyond pitch black. I didn't hear the toy anymore, but I knew it was still out there watching. I never found out where it came from or why it chose our house. The police said my parents had died from carbon monoxide poisoning, but that didn't explain the toy or the scratches on the floor where it had dragged me. I moved in with my aunt after that, but every Christmas since, I've made sure to avoid presents wrapped in red paper. And even now I can't sleep if I hear a faint scraping sound in the dark.